The morning alarm screamed across mining colony 7749X like it had done every day for the past 300 years. Daiho rolled off his thin sleeping mat and pulled on his work clothes. The fabric was rough and gray just like everything else, in the underground city that used to be Seoul. Above him, somewhere far away, was the real sky, but Daiho had never seen it. None of the humans had. The tunnels stretched for kilometers in every direction. They went so deep that the workers needed breathing masks to survive. The air was thick with dust and the smell of burning metal. Every few hundred meters, tall gray. Aliens stood on raised platforms. The Velkari had 4 arms and black glass eyes that never seemed to blink. Energy whips hung from their belts, crackling with blue electricity. Daiho grabbed his helmet and mining tools from the storage locker. The helmet was cracked down one side, but it still worked. Everything the humans owned was broken or damaged, but they made it work anyway. They had to. The Velkari did not care if their slaves lived or died as long as the mining quotas were met. Every day, the main tunnel was already crowded with workers heading to their assigned sectors. Hundreds of humans moved in silence through the artificial light. Speaking too loudly or moving too slowly would attract attention from the guards. Attention from the Velkari was never good. People who attracted too much attention simply disappeared. One day and were never seen again. Daiho reached Mining Sector 7 and picked up his assigned cart. The cart was heavy even when empty. When loaded with ore, it took all his strength to push it through the narrow passages. His father had pushed the same cart for 20 years before his back gave out. Now his father worked in the processing plant, where the air was even worse and the hours were longer. The work began immediately. Daiho used his plasma cutter to slice chunks of rare metal from the tunnel walls. The metal was some kind of energy conductor that powered the Velkari warships. Every piece of ore that left this planet would be used to keep other worlds under alien control. The thought made Daiho angry, but he kept his face blank. Showing emotion was dangerous. Overseer Keth stood on his platform watching the human workers. His 4 arms moved constantly as he checked data tablets and monitored productivity levels. Sometimes he would point at a worker with one of his long gray fingers. When that happened, 2 guard Velkari would drag the chosen human away. Nobody knew exactly what happened to them, but they never came back to the mining tunnels. By midday, Daiho had filled his cart 3 times. His shoulders ached, and his hands were bleeding from gripping the rough handles. The breathing mask made every breath taste like metal and chemicals. Around him, other workers moved like ghosts through the artificial twilight of the underground world. Some were young like him, others were old and bent from decades of hard labor. During the short meal break, Daiho sat with his childhood friend Kyung-ho. They ate the gray protein paste that all workers received twice daily. It had no taste and barely enough nutrition to keep a human alive. The Velkari calculated exactly how much food their slaves needed to work effectively and gave them nothing more. Kyung-ho leaned close and whispered very quietly. His words were almost lost in the noise of machinery and distant blasting. He told Daiho about rumors spreading through the tunnels. Stories about human colonies on distant worlds fighting, back against their alien masters. Tales of Velkari supply ships disappearing without explanation. Most workers dismissed these stories as fantasy, but Kyung-ho seemed to believe them. Daiho wanted to believe the rumors, too, but hope was a luxury that slaves could not afford. He had heard similar stories before, and nothing had changed. The Velkari still controlled everything. Their warships still patrolled the space around Earth. Their guards still carried energy whips and plasma rifles. What could a bunch of miners do against technology that could destroy entire planets? The afternoon shift was even harder than the morning. The ore seams were deeper now, and the air was getting thicker. Several workers collapsed from exhaustion and were dragged away by medical robots. The robots would patch them up just enough to work again tomorrow. The Velkari did not waste resources on proper medical care for their slaves. As evening approached, Daiho noticed something strange. The Velkari guards seemed nervous about something. They checked their weapons more often and talked among themselves in their clicking alien language. Overseer Keth kept looking at his communication device, and his black eyes seemed worried. Something was happening, but the human workers had no way to know what. The shift ended when the alarm sounded again. Daiho pushed his final cartload to the processing station and cleaned his tools. His daily quota was met, but barely. Tomorrow he would have to work even harder to keep up with the increasing demands. The Velkari always wanted more ore, and they did not care how many humans died to get it. Walking back through the tunnels to the living quarters, Daiho saw something that made him stop. Painted on the wall in small letters was a message. The paint was still wet, so someone had written it very recently. The message said simply, "We remember freedom." Below it was a symbol that Daiho recognized from old history books. It was the flag of Korea from before the Velkari came. The message was gone by the next morning, painted over with gray compound, but Daiho could not forget it. Someone in the tunnels still remembered what life was like before the aliens arrived. Someone still believed that things could change. As he picked up his mining cart and started another day of endless labor, Daiho felt something he had not experienced in years. He felt hope. Deep in the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the old city of Busan, something important was happening. In a hidden chamber lit by salvaged glow panels, 200 humans sat in careful silence. They were miners and factory workers and maintenance technicians. All of them had spent their entire lives as slaves, but tonight they were something else. Tonight they were revolutionaries. The woman standing before them was named Somin. She had once been an engineer before the Velkari destroyed the universities and turned all humans into manual laborers. Now she was the leader of the largest resistance cell on Earth. Her voice was quiet, but every word carried the weight of 3 centuries of oppression. Somin told them about intercepted alien communications. She explained what their captured equipment had revealed about Velkari technology and tactics. Most importantly, she shared intelligence gathered from resistance groups on other human worlds. The alien empire was not as strong as it appeared. It was held together by fear and the threat of overwhelming retaliation against any world that dared to resist. The plan was simple, but it would require perfect timing. Every human world would rise at exactly the same moment. Communication centers would be destroyed first to prevent the Velkari from coordinating their response. Then weapons depots and administrative centers would be hit. The goal was not to defeat the alien military, but to cause so much chaos that the empire would collapse from within. The signal would come from Earth. An ancient radio frequency that the Velkari had long ago stopped monitoring would carry the message to rebel cells throughout the galaxy. When that signal was received, every human world would know that the time had come to throw off their chains and fight for freedom. As the secret meeting ended, the conspirators melted back into the shadows of the underground city. They had been planning this moment for years. Weapons were hidden in abandoned tunnels. Communication equipment was concealed in maintenance areas. Training had been conducted in forgotten industrial complexes far from alien surveillance. The revolution was coming, and it would begin here on Earth in the tunnels where humanity had suffered for 3 long centuries. Soon the galaxy would learn what humans could accomplish when they stopped being afraid and started being angry. The Velkari had ruled through terror for too long. It was time for the slaves to remind their masters that freedom was worth any price. The signal came at exactly 3 in the morning when most of the galaxy was sleeping. Jinwoo crouched in the ruins of what used to be Tokyo, holding the detonator in his shaking hands. Around him, 12 other humans waited in the darkness carrying weapons they had built from stolen Velkari technology. Above them, the massive communication relay tower stretched into the night sky like a metal finger pointing at the stars. For months, they had planned this moment. Every detail had been discussed and rehearsed. The tower was the primary communication hub for the entire Sol system. When it fell, the Velkhari would lose contact with their garrison forces throughout human space. It would be the first blow in a war that had been brewing for 3 centuries. Jinwu pressed the button, and the world exploded in light and sound. The tower collapsed in sections, each piece falling like a giant metal tree. The explosion could be seen from orbit, and within minutes, similar fires were blazing on every human world in the galaxy. The revolution had begun, and there would be no turning back. On the agricultural world of New Jeju, Hunwoo stood in a wheat field watching the alien garrison burn in the distance. Around him, 1,000 farmers held weapons that had been designed to harvest crops, but worked just as well for killing Velkhari. Plasma cutters meant for cutting grain stalks could slice through alien armor like it was paper. Heavy transport vehicles designed for moving food had become improvised tanks with their thick metal hulls deflecting enemy energy weapons. The Velkhari had never expected trouble from the farming worlds. The humans who worked there seemed peaceful and content growing food for the Empire, but farmers understood soil and weather and the cycles of planting and harvest. They also understood that some crops needed to be burned away completely before new ones could grow. The battle raged across the endless fields of grain for 3 days and 3 nights. The Velkhari called for help, but their messages disappeared into empty space. Their communication network was gone, and they found themselves fighting blind against enemies they had dismissed as simple food producers. The farmers used tactics learned from ancient Earth wars, striking fast from the cover of tall grain and then vanishing before the aliens could respond. Hyunwoo led his people in hit-and-run attacks that wore down the enemy garrison. They knew every hill and stream and hidden path on their world, while the Velkhari were strangers who had never bothered to learn the local geography. When the aliens tried to pursue the humans into the wheat fields, they found themselves lost in a golden maze where death could come from any direction. By the 4th morning, the Velkhari garrison was destroyed and New Jeju was free. Similar victories were happening on dozens of other agricultural worlds, as farmers everywhere discovered that growing things and fighting things required many of the same skills. The Velkhari had made the mistake of thinking that peaceful people could not be dangerous when they needed to be. In the asteroid mining belt around Tau Ceti system, Youngmin was turning industrial equipment into weapons of war. The massive magnetic launchers used to send ore containers to processing stations could also throw chunks of metal at Velkhari patrol ships. The aliens had energy shields designed to stop sophisticated weapons, but simple rocks traveling at incredible speed went right through their defenses. Youngmin had worked on the mining platforms for 15 years, learning every system and control panel. When the revolution began, he and his crew seized control of Platform 7 and turned it into a fortress. The same computers that tracked ore shipments now calculated firing solutions for improvised weapons. The Velkhari had built their mining operations to be efficient, but they never considered that efficiency could be turned against them. The patrol ships came in formation expecting to crush the rebellion with superior firepower. Instead, they found themselves under attack from weapons they could not identify or defend against. Chunks of raw metal the size of small buildings slammed into their hulls at velocities that turned the strongest materials into vapor. The Velkhari shields flickered and died under impacts their designers had never imagined. One by one, the patrol ships were destroyed or crippled by weapons that had been mining equipment just hours before. The survivors fled deeper into the asteroid. But Youngmin and his people followed in mining shuttles that could navigate the dangerous rock fields better than any military vessel. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Velkhari were learning what it felt like to be prey. The most important battle was happening in orbit around Earth itself. Ji-hoon had spent 5 years working as a maintenance technician on the massive Velkhari command station that controlled all military operations in the Sol system. During those years, he had memorized every corridor and access panel and security system. When the revolution began, he was ready. The alien crew of the station never suspected that the quiet human who repaired their equipment and cleaned their floors was also documenting their weaknesses. Ji-hoon had mapped every vital system and identified the most vulnerable points. He knew which computers controlled the defensive weapons and which ones managed life support. Most importantly, he had figured out how to turn the station's own guns against the Velkhari fleet. At exactly the same moment that Jinwoo destroyed the communication tower, Ji-hoon and his team seized control of the orbital fortress. The alien crew was caught completely off guard by the sudden revolt of their slaves. Within minutes, humans were in control of the most powerful weapons platform in the solar system, and they were using it to destroy the same ships it had been built to protect. The irony was perfect in its simplicity. The Velkhari were being killed by their own technology operated by the very people they had enslaved. Every plasma cannon and missile launcher that had once kept humanity in chains was now turned against their former masters. The orbital battle lasted only 2 hours before the surviving Velkhari ships fled to hyperspace, leaving Earth's orbit clear for the first time in 3 centuries. As news of the victories spread through hidden communication networks, more and more worlds joined the rebellion. The Velkhari found themselves fighting on 1,000 different fronts simultaneously. Their superior technology was useless when they could not coordinate their forces or predict where the next attack would come from. On the factory world of Nu, Busan human workers seized control of the weapons manufacturing plants and turned them against their alien supervisors. On the crystal mining stations of the Outer Rim, enslaved humans used industrial lasers to cut Velkhari ships apart piece by piece. Even on the prison worlds where the most dangerous rebels had been sent, the inmates overpowered their guards and joined the growing revolution. The Velkhari Empire had been built on the assumption that superior technology and overwhelming force could keep inferior species in line forever. But they had forgotten that technology was only as good as the people who used it, and force only worked as long as your enemies were afraid to fight back. Humanity was no longer afraid, and they were proving that 300 years of slavery had not broken their spirit. If anything, the long oppression had made them stronger and more determined. They had learned patience and cunning and how to work together toward a common goal. Now they were using those lessons to tear apart the empire that had tried to destroy them. The galaxy watched in amazement as the impossible became reality before their eyes. The humans were winning, and their victory was inspiring other enslaved species to consider their own rebellions. The Velkhari Empire that had seemed eternal and unshakable was beginning to crack, and the cracks were spreading faster than anyone had dared to hope. The Velkhari response came like thunder across the galaxy. Emperor Thakul sat on his crystal throne in the heart of the imperial palace and issued orders that would either crush the human rebellion or destroy entire worlds trying. If the slaves wanted freedom, they would pay for it with the lives of billions. The message was simple and terrifying: surrender now or watch your homeworlds burn. The planet killer ships were the most feared weapons in the Velkhari arsenal. Each one was the size of a small moon and carried enough firepower to crack a world like an egg. They moved slowly through hyperspace, but nothing could stop them once they reached their target. The first ship was already heading toward New Sol, the most important human colony in the Centauri system. Governor Sujin received the ultimatum while standing in her office overlooking the capital city of 4 billion people. She had 3 days to surrender unconditionally and return her world to Velkhari control. If she refused, the planet killer would arrive and turn New Sol into a field of glowing debris. The choice was simple: submit to slavery again or watch everyone. She had sworn to protect Dai in nuclear fire. Sujin looked out at the city streets filled with humans who were celebrating their newfound freedom. Children played in parks that had been forbidden to them under alien rule. Workers walked to jobs they had chosen instead of being forced into. Artists created beautiful things instead of propaganda for their masters. In 3 days, it might all be ashes, but at least her people had tasted liberty, even if only for a brief moment. Instead of surrendering, Sujin gave the evacuation order. Every ship on the planet and in the nearby systems was pressed into service. Civilian transports cargo, Haulers and even small personal spacecraft began loading refugees and heading for safer worlds. It would be impossible to save everyone, but they would save as many as they could. The rest would stay and fight for the home they loved. Commander Minho stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the Velkari fleet approach through the darkness of space. His force was a mixture of captured alien ships and converted civilian vessels crewed by former miners and farmers who had learned to fight in the past few weeks. They were outnumbered 10-1 and outgunned by weapons they barely understood. But retreat was not an option. Behind Minho lay New Sol with its 4 billion people. Ahead lay certain death for most of his crews, but that did not matter anymore. Some things were worth dying for, and the right to live as free beings was one of them. His ships spread out in a defensive formation that would not stop the planet killer, but might delay it long enough for the evacuation to succeed. The battle began when the Velkari fleet was still hours away from the planet. Human fighters launched from converted cargo ships and threw themselves against the alien escorts with desperate courage. They had no sophisticated tactics or superior weapons, just the fury of people who had nothing left to lose except their dignity. Ship after ship died in brilliant explosions that lit up the space around New Sol like fireworks. Each loss bought precious minutes for the refugee transports fleeing toward the outer system. The human pilots knew they were dying, but they kept attacking anyway because every second of delay meant more lives saved on the surface below. Minho watched his fleet disappear piece by piece on the tactical display. The converted mining vessel Seogen's Hope rammed a Velkari cruiser and took it down in mutual destruction. The former passenger liner New Freedom held off 3 enemy destroyers until its reactor went critical and vaporized everything within 1,000 kilometers. One by one, his ships were dying, but the planet killer was still coming. With only a dozen ships left, Minho made the decision that would define the battle. His flagship Freedom's Dawn was a converted cargo hauler with improvised armor and weapons that should never have been able to threaten a real warship. But it was fast and maneuverable and crewed by people who had already accepted death as the price of freedom. The planet killer was a massive target that could not dodge or hide. Its shields were designed to stop conventional weapons, but Minho was not planning to fire at it. Instead, he aimed his ship directly at the giant weapon array that could crack worlds. If he could disable that system, the planet killer would be just another big slow ship that his remaining forces could handle. The ramming attack took place at nearly the speed of light. Freedom's Dawn slammed into the planet killer's primary weapon, with enough force to shatter both ships instantly. The explosion was visible from the planet's surface and created a brief new star in the night sky of New Sol. When the light faded, the planet killer was crippled and drifting helplessly, while the surviving human ships closed in for the kill. The Velkari fleet limped away in defeat, but the victory had cost almost everything. Nearly half the human fleet was destroyed, and thousands of brave souls had paid the ultimate price for their world's survival. The evacuation had saved 2 billion people, but 2 billion more remained on New Sol, waiting to see if their sacrifice had been worthwhile. News of the victory spread through the resistance networks like wildfire. Humanity had faced the Empire's ultimate weapon and won, but everyone understood what it meant. The Velkari would return with bigger fleets and deadlier weapons. The revolution had entered its most dangerous phase, where victory and complete annihilation hung in the balance. On Earth, the underground factories worked around the clock, turning out weapons and ships with technology stolen from their former masters. Every human world had become an arsenal, and every city a fortress. They had learned the most important lesson of their long enslavement: freedom was not something that could be given. It had to be taken and defended with constant vigilance. Cost was becoming clear as casualty reports came in from battles across the galaxy. Millions of humans had died in the first weeks of the revolution, and millions more would die before it ended. But for the first time in 3 centuries, they were dying as free beings fighting for something they believed in, instead of as slaves working for masters who saw them as disposable tools. Children who had been born in slavery were learning to read books that had been banned under Velkhari rule. Artists were creating music and poetry that celebrated human culture instead of alien superiority. Scientists were working on projects designed to benefit humanity instead of making their oppressors more powerful. The revolution was changing more than just who ruled the galaxy. It was changing what it meant to be human. But the war was far from over, and the Velkhari were preparing their final response. Deep in the core systems, massive fleets were gathering around weapons that made planet killers look like toys. The aliens had ruled the galaxy for millennia, and they would not give up their empire without using every terrible weapon at their disposal. The next phase of the war would test everything humanity had learned about courage and sacrifice. It would determine whether the species that had survived 3 centuries of slavery could survive the terrible price of freedom. The stakes could not be higher, and failure would mean not just defeat, but the complete extinction of the human race. In the ruins of cities that had once been centers of Velkhari power, human rebels prepared for the battles to come. They cleaned their weapons and said goodbye to loved ones and tried not to think about the odds against them. They had come too far to turn back now, and they would see this fight through to the end, whatever that end might be. The price of freedom was written in blood across the stars, but it was a price that humanity was willing to pay. They had remembered what it felt like to stand upright instead of kneeling, and they would never kneel again, no matter what it cost them. Deep in the ruins of Seoul University linguist Yoonji worked by the light of stolen glow panels, studying captured Velkhari communications. For months, she had been analyzing thousands of intercepted messages, looking for patterns and weaknesses in the alien command structure. What she discovered changed everything and gave the human rebellion hope they had never dared to imagine. Hidden in the coded transmissions were complaints and protests from dozens of other species throughout the galaxy. The Velkhari Empire was not the unified force it appeared to be. For over 1,000 years, the aliens had conquered and enslaved hundreds of different civilizations and forced them to serve the imperial war machine. All of them lived under the same cruel system that had oppressed humanity for 3 centuries. The revelation was staggering. The Kitani were master shipbuilders from the Galactic Rim whose sleek vessels had been forced to carry Velkhari troops to new conquests. The Vorthak were cybernetic engineers who had designed much of the Empire's communication networks under threat of genocide. The Zephyrians possessed crystal technology that powered alien weapons but had never been allowed to use it for their own defense. Yoonji's discovery meant that humanity was not alone in their struggle against the Velkhari. Across the galaxy, millions of enslaved beings were suffering under the same oppression and dreaming of the same freedom. If they could be contacted and organized, they might join the human rebellion and turn it into something far more dangerous. To the Empire. Taman became humanity's first ambassador to the other enslaved species. He was a former communications engineer who understood alien technology well enough to establish contact with resistance groups throughout the galaxy. His first breakthrough came when he made contact with a Kitani fleet commander named Sethel, who had been secretly sabotaging Velkhari military operations for decades. The Kitani ships began appearing alongside human vessels in raids against enemy supply convoys. Their technology complemented human innovation perfectly. Kitani speed and stealth combined with human tactical unpredictability created a deadly combination that the Velkhari could not counter. For the first time in a millennium, the master race was facing coordinated resistance from multiple species working together. The Vorthak proved even more valuable as allies than anyone had expected. Their deep understanding of Velkhari computer systems allowed human hackers to penetrate what remained of the Empire's communication networks. Suddenly, the aliens found their own technology turning against them in ways they could not predict or prevent. Supply ships received false orders and delivered their cargo to rebel bases instead of Imperial garrisons. Defense systems shut down, at critical moments allowing raiders to strike heavily defended targets. Military communications were intercepted and decoded, giving the Alliance advance warning of Velkhari fleet movements. The empire that had ruled through superior technology began to crumble as that same technology became unreliable and dangerous to use. But the most shocking alliance came from an unexpected source. A faction of Velkhari themselves, led by a young warrior named Cthulhu, reached out to the human resistance through secret channels. These aliens had grown disgusted with their empire's cruelty and saw the human rebellion as their chance to overthrow the corrupt regime that had brought shame to their entire species. The psychological impact was enormous. If even the master race was abandoning their empire, then the rebellion had become something more than a slave revolt. It was a galactic civil war between those who believed in freedom and those who clung to the old ways of domination and oppression. The moral authority of the Velkhari government collapsed overnight as their own people joined the revolution. Seo Hyun commanded the liberated orbital fortress above Mars and served as coordinator for the growing alliance. The old human tendency toward cooperation and diplomacy had emerged stronger than ever after centuries of suppression. Where the Velkhari had ruled through fear and division, humanity was uniting their new allies through shared purpose and mutual respect. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Former enemies were working side by side to build something unprecedented in galactic history. Kitani engineers helped humans design better ships, while human tacticians taught alien crews new ways to fight. Vorthak technicians shared their cybernetic knowledge while learning human-computer programming techniques that they had never imagined possible. Communication became the biggest challenge as dozens of different species tried to coordinate military operations across thousands of light years. Human linguists like Yunji worked with alien scholars to develop new translation protocols and simplified command languages. The Alliance was literally learning to speak with one voice as they fought for their common freedom. The Zephyrians brought their crystal technology to the Alliance and revolutionized energy weapons design. Their living crystals could store and focus power in ways that conventional technology could not match. Combined with human engineering creativity, they produced weapons that could pierce Velkhari shields and armor with devastating effect. On the industrial world of New Daegu Alien, refugees worked alongside human factory crews to mass-produce the new weapons. Former Velkhari slaves taught their liberators how to operate captured equipment while learning human manufacturing techniques. The production lines ran day and night, turning out ships and weapons at a rate that surprised everyone, including the Alliance leadership. Intelligence networks that had taken the Velkhari centuries to build were turned against them by their own former subjects. The aliens discovered that every species they had enslaved had been quietly gathering information and waiting for the right moment to strike back. Now that moment had arrived, and decades of careful preparation were paying off in ways the Empire could never have anticipated. The tide of war was turning as more species joined the Alliance. What had begun as a desperate human uprising had become a galactic revolution involving hundreds of different civilizations. The Velkhari still controlled the core systems and their massive industrial capacity, but they were increasingly isolated as their empire collapsed around them. Ancient grievances that had been suppressed for centuries suddenly burst into open warfare. Species that had been enemies under Velkhari rule discovered they had more in common with each other than with their former masters. The Empire's policy of divide and conquer was backfiring spectacularly as their subjects united against them. The Alliance fleet grew larger every day as more worlds declared their independence and more alien crews defected from Imperial service. Human commanders found themselves leading mixed squadrons of ships from a dozen different species, all working together with a precision that impressed even veteran officers. Training became a priority as the Alliance tried to standardize tactics and procedures across dozens of different military traditions. Human drill sergeants worked with alien instructors to create new combat doctrines that took advantage of each species' unique strengths. The result was a military force unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The final phase of the war was approaching, and this time the rebels would not face the Velkhari alone. They would attack the heart of the Empire with a united galaxy behind, them determined to end the reign of terror that had lasted for over 2 millennia. The slaves had become soldiers, and the soldiers were ready to finish what the miners and farmers had started in the tunnels beneath Earth. The assault fleet gathered in the empty space beyond the galactic core, like a storm waiting to break. Dongyun stood on the bridge of the Alliance flagship Unity, watching thousands of ships from dozens of species form into attack formations. Human vessels flew alongside Kitani destroyers and Vorthak cruisers, while Zephyrian crystal ships pulsed with stored energy. It was the largest armada in galactic history, and it had one purpose: to crack the heart of the Velkhari Empire. Velkhara. Prime had never been successfully attacked in over 2,000 years of Imperial history. The planet was protected by energy shields that could withstand the impact of asteroids, and defended by fleets that had crushed every enemy they had ever faced. The fortress world sat at the center of a star system filled with automated defense, platforms and minefields that stretched for billions of kilometers in every direction. But the Alliance had advantages that no previous enemy had possessed. Human ingenuity, combined with alien technology, had produced weapons and tactics the Velkhari had never encountered. More importantly, they had detailed intelligence provided by Cthulhu and his rebel faction, who knew the location of every shield, generator, and defense platform on the Imperial capital. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the main fleet engaged the orbital defenses, small strike teams would slip through the chaos to reach the planet's surface. Their mission was to plant quantum charges at the primary shield generators located deep beneath the capital city. If they succeeded, the planet's defenses would collapse, and the way would be open for a final assault on the Imperial Palace. Boyoung led Strike Team 7, a mixed unit of elite soldiers from 6 different species. They had trained together for months, learning to work as a single unit despite their different biologies and fighting styles. The Kitani warrior Sivith could move through shadows like a ghost, while the Vorthak trooper Nexus could interface directly with alien computer systems. Each member brought unique skills that would be essential to the mission's success. The battle began with the largest space engagement in recorded history. Tens of thousands of ships clashed in the void above Velkhara Prime, turning space itself into a maze of energy beams and exploding vessels. The Velkhari fought with the desperation of beings who knew their empire's survival hung in the balance, while the Alliance forces attacked with the fury of species that had endured millennia of oppression. Dongyun coordinated the massive fleet action from his command center deep inside Unity. The ship had been built from the hulk of a captured Velkhari dreadnought, but modified with technology. From every Alliance species, its weapons could punch through the strongest shields, while its armor could absorb punishment that would vaporize lesser vessels. It was a symbol of what the galaxy's free peoples could accomplish when they worked together. The orbital battle raged for hours, as both sides committed everything they had to the fight. Velkhari planet killers tried to break through the Alliance formation, while human carriers launched wave after wave of fighters. Kitani destroyers darted between the massive capital ships like deadly sharks, while Zephyrian crystal vessels discharged stored energy in devastating beam attacks that could slice through multiple enemies at once, while the fleets tore each other. Apart above the planet, Boyoung's strike team descended through the battle-torn atmosphere in stealth pods. Their entry was covered by the chaos of the space battle, but landing safely would require skill and more than a little luck. The pods were designed to be invisible to Velkhari sensors, but they were also fragile and could be destroyed by stray weapons, fire, or debris from the orbital combat. The team landed in the industrial sector of the capital city and immediately found themselves in the middle of urban warfare, unlike anything they had experienced before. Every street was a battleground, and every building was a potential fortress. The Velkari civilian population had been indoctrinated from birth to believe in their racial superiority, and they fought alongside their military forces with fanatical determination. But the Alliance soldiers had something their enemies lacked. They were fighting not just for victory, but for the right to exist as free beings. Every step forward was paid for with blood, but they kept advancing through the maze of burning buildings and rubble-filled streets toward their objective deep beneath the city center. The shield generators were located in a massive underground complex that had been carved from solid rock over centuries of construction. The facility was protected by multiple layers of security, including energy barriers, automated weapons, and guard posts manned by the Empire's most elite troops. Getting inside would require everything the strike team had learned about combat and infiltration. As they approached the generator complex, Boyung discovered they were not alone. Kethul and his rebel Velkari forces had been fighting a guerrilla campaign in the city's lower levels for months, preparing for this moment. The sight of former slaves and former masters working together created a powerful symbol that the galaxy's oppressed peoples could unite against tyranny regardless of their species or origin. The battle for the shield generators lasted 6 hours and cost the lives of half the strike team members. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The quantum charges were planted and detonated at precisely the right moment, sending shock waves through the planetary defense grid. For the first time in its history, Velkara Prime lay exposed to enemy attack. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. If their capital could fall, then no Velkari world was safe from the Alliance forces. Surrender offers began flooding in from throughout the Empire as local governors abandoned their allegiance to a regime that could no longer protect them. The Empire that had seemed eternal was collapsing faster than anyone had dared to hope. Dongyun's fleet broke through the orbital defenses and began landing troops in the capital city. Human Marines fought alongside Katani commandos and Vorthak, assault units as they pushed toward the Imperial Palace. The defenders fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies and the fury of centuries of pent-up rage. The final battle took place in the crystal halls of the Imperial Palace itself. Emperor Thakul made his last stand surrounded by his personal guard in the throne room where his ancestors had ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia. But even the most elite Velkari warriors could not stop the tide of revolution that had swept across the stars. Thakul's final transmission was both defiant and pathetic. He promised that the Velkari would return someday to reclaim their rightful place as masters of the galaxy. He insisted that inferior species could never truly rule themselves and would eventually beg for the return of imperial order. His words echoed across space as Alliance forces occupied the palace and hauled down the banners that had flown over 1,000 conquered worlds. The fall of Velkara Prime marked the end of the oldest and most powerful empire in galactic history. But victory came at a terrible cost. Millions of beings from dozens of species had died in the final assault, and many more would die before the last remnants of imperial resistance were crushed. The price of freedom had been written in blood across the stars, but it was a price that every Alliance member was willing to pay. As news of the Emperor's defeat spread throughout the galaxy, the remaining Velkari forces began to surrender or flee to the unexplored regions beyond the spiral arm. The Empire was dead, but the work of building something better in its place was just beginning. For the first time in over 2,000 years, the galaxy belonged to all its children instead of just one dominant species. The revolution was over, but the real challenge was about to begin. How do you govern a galaxy where hundreds of different species have different needs and different ideas about how to live? The Alliance had learned to fight together, but now they would have to learn something even more difficult: how to live together in peace. 1 year after the fall of Velkara Prime, Jaehyun stood on the observation deck of Unity Station, watching ships from dozens of different species dock at the massive space facility. The station had been built in neutral space halfway between Earth and the former imperial capital as a symbol of the new galactic order. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see crews from every Alliance world working together to create something that had never existed before in galactic history, a truly cooperative civilization. The transition from Empire to Alliance had not been easy or peaceful. The collapse of Velkhari rule had left a power vacuum that threatened to tear the galaxy apart before the new government could establish itself. Warlords emerged on former imperial worlds claiming authority over entire sectors. Crime syndicates seized control of important trade routes and began charging tribute from merchant vessels. Some species sought violent revenge against their former oppressors, rather than the justice that Alliance leaders were trying to establish. It had taken all of humanity's diplomatic skills learned through centuries of internal conflict on Earth to forge a working government from the chaos. The old human talent for negotiation and compromise had emerged stronger than ever after the long years of slavery. Where other species saw only differences and reasons for conflict, humans saw opportunities for cooperation and mutual benefit. Myung served as one of the first human ambassadors to the new Galactic Council, where former slaves now sat as equals, with representatives of every free world. The council chambers had been built inside Unity Station and were designed to accommodate the different environmental needs of dozens of species. Atmospheric controls could adjust oxygen levels and gravity fields, while translation systems allowed instant communication between beings who had never been able to speak to each other as equals before. The most difficult challenge was deciding what to do with the Velkhari who had survived their empire's collapse. Many Alliance members wanted revenge for centuries of oppression and demanded that the former master race be enslaved or eliminated completely. But cooler voices, including many humans, argued that cycles of revenge would only perpetuate the violence and hatred that had torn the galaxy apart for so long. Some Velkhari, like Cthulhu, had embraced the Alliance cause and worked to make amends for their species' crimes. They provided valuable intelligence about hidden Imperial weapon caches and helped track down war criminals who were trying to escape justice. Others remained bitter and resentful, requiring careful monitoring to prevent them from starting new conflicts with their former subjects. The economic transformation was equally dramatic and challenging. The Empire's slave-based economy had collapsed overnight when the rebellion succeeded. Entire industries that had depended on forced labor suddenly found themselves without workers or customers. New systems had to be created based on free trade and voluntary cooperation rather than conquest and exploitation. Human entrepreneurs led the way in developing new business models that benefited all Alliance members. Their creativity had been suppressed during 3 centuries of slavery, but now it exploded in every direction at once. Former miners became inventors, creating new technologies from salvaged Imperial equipment. Ex-slaves who had been forced to work in factories started their own companies based on cooperative ownership and profit sharing. The galaxy discovered that cooperation was far more profitable than conquest. When people were free to choose their own work and keep the fruits of their labor, they produced far more than they ever had as slaves. Trade between worlds increased dramatically as species that had been forbidden to interact under Imperial rule began exchanging goods, ideas, and cultural practices. On Earth, the transformation was visible everywhere. The old mining tunnels had been converted into museums and memorial sites where school children learned about the long struggle for freedom. Chan Wu, now an elderly man, guided tours through the depths where his generation had toiled as slaves. The contrast between past and present was stark and served as a reminder of how far humanity had come. The surface of Earth was being restored after centuries of industrial exploitation. Clean air flowed through cities that had been choked with pollution under Velkhari rule. Parks and gardens replaced the ugly concrete structures that the aliens had built to house their human workers. Art and music that celebrated human culture instead of imperial propaganda filled the public spaces with beauty and joy. Education became a priority as Alliance worlds worked to rebuild knowledge and skills that had been suppressed during the long years of slavery. Universities reopened their doors to students of every species, while research centers focused on projects that would benefit all galactic citizens instead of just the ruling class. The free exchange of ideas produced innovations and discoveries at a rate that amazed even the most optimistic observers. The military threat had not completely disappeared from the galaxy. Intelligence reports suggested that remnants of the Velkari fleet had gathered in the unexplored regions beyond the Spiral Arm and might be planning a return. Other former Imperial species who had not joined the Alliance were reportedly building their own empires in distant sectors. New challenges would emerge and new threats would arise, but humanity and their allies faced the future with confidence born of shared struggle and victory. The memorial wall in Unity Station's central plaza bore the names of every being who had died in the Liberation War regardless of their species or which side they had originally fought for. At its center was a simple inscription in dozens of languages: "They ruled the galaxy, and it was their galaxy until we took it back." Below that, in smaller text, was humanity's gift to the cosmos. Freedom is not a destination, but a journey that never ends. Children from every Alliance world came to visit the memorial and learn about the price their ancestors had paid for liberty. Human kids played with young Katani and Vorthak offspring, while their parents worked together on projects that would benefit the entire galaxy. The old barriers of species and culture were slowly breaking down as a new generation grew up knowing only freedom and cooperation. Scientists from different worlds collaborated on research projects that would have been impossible under Imperial rule. Katani engineers worked with human inventors to design faster ships, while Zephyrian crystal growers helped Vorthak computer specialists create new forms of artificial intelligence. The combination of different perspectives and technologies was producing breakthroughs that no single species could have achieved alone.